Chapter 10. Be in love, and you will be happy. Within no time, Catherine and I were living together in my tiny house, completely head over heels in love. We would have married each other after knowing each other just 2 weeks, but figured we probably should wait. Besides, there wasn't an ounce of fear or doubt in regards to how dedicated we were to each other. It was truly magical, and the energy between us was so powerful that if the two of us held a light bulb in our hands, it probably would have lit up. We spent every waking minute together, except for work, but still it wasn't enough. In December, we started thinking that it might be a good idea to quit our jobs and take an extended vacation. That way we could be together 24/7. It sounded a bit eccentric, especially to our friends and family, but we knew that someday we would have the responsibilities that come with a home, children, and work, and that it would be decades before we'd have this kind of opportunity again. We each gave our employers 2 weeks' notice and began planning for a road trip that would eventually take us to the Florida Keys. On January 1st, 1991, we said goodbye to the little house I was renting and moved all of our belongings into the basement of my mother's home, the place I was so eager to leave only 1 year before. The past year had been pivotal for me, with a lot of personal growth and progress, but this would be a new chapter, more like a second rebirth in my life, and one that I couldn't wait to embark on. No longer would I be going it alone. I now had a partner, a companion, and finally, after so many long and lonely years, felt complete. It was a little tough to put my drums in storage and my artistic dreams on hold, but I couldn't wait to have the wife, kids, and a house with a white picket fence. For these, I would gladly give up everything. After celebrating the holiday season with family and friends, we packed up my future wife's 1990 Volkswagen Golf with camping gear and supplies and headed south with a return date of unknown. It was a fun and exciting trip. After a brief stay in Atlanta to visit with friends, we arrived at my Uncle George's home in Coral Gables, where we would spend the bulk of our time in Florida. We then headed further south down the Keys, where we found a perfect campsite right on the ocean. We would spend lazy, sun-drenched days on the beach, simply enjoying each other's company. I would read or strum an acoustic guitar, while Catherine made beaded jewelry. For dinner, we'd buy the local catch and grill it over a campfire. And at night, we'd gaze at the stars and talk about the future. What a magical time. In late February, after 8 blissful weeks in Florida, we decided it was time to go back home and begin making the necessary arrangements for a spring wedding. Since money would be tight, and not feeling the need for anything extravagant, we chose to get married on the grounds of Catherine's mother's home. It would be a small, intimate celebration, with only the closest of friends and family present. My wife's sister Carolyn would be the maid of honor, and her boyfriend, my good friend Scott, would serve as my best man. 8 months earlier, Scott and Carolyn were introducing me to Catherine on the front porch of my little blue house. It's funny the way life unfolds. We were married on May 18th, 1991, and it was the perfect day for an outdoor wedding. The air was crisp and refreshing due to a thunderstorm the night before that pushed some sticky, humid air out to sea. The sun was warm and the sky was deep blue. We couldn't have asked for a better wedding day, and everyone had a great time. For our honeymoon, we took that entire summer off. We would spend most days at the beach, lounging in the sun, reading books, or taking long walks. On weekends, we would travel to Boston, where we'd take in a museum or the many interesting shops, mostly used record stores, which were plentiful on Massachusetts Avenue. It had been a tremendous year, filled with the happiness that comes from spending significant time with the person you love. But soon it would be time to get back to the grind and begin saving money for our future. In September, my wife got a teaching job, and I, in October, went back to delivering auto parts for the family-owned business where all of this started. Chapter 11. The soul lives on. During that winter, with no change in my father's condition, my mother decided to have his feeding tubes removed. This was a choice that was not without controversy. My father's sister vehemently disapproved of such action, thinking it just wasn't right because he was still technically, quote-unquote, alive. But my mother felt that after 16 months of life support, coupled with seeing him in that state day after day after day, it was time to let him go. On December 23rd, 1991, my father passed away. As sad as this was for me, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that he was very much alive spiritually, and that we would see each other again and resume the relationship we once had, but had yet to fully develop. For my mother and sister, who had been by his side the whole way through, it had been a very, very long, hard road, and I was relieved to see that her long suffering was finally over. In all the months my father was on life support, I saw him only once. On that occasion, I had a complete and total emotional breakdown. To see him in that state was just too overwhelming, and I remember thinking how wrong it was to keep him like this. At that point in my life, I lacked the inner strength to endure the pain and sadness of seeing my father in that state, as well as the wisdom to understand the complexities and challenges that present themselves during times like those. But what I did know even at that time was that life is everlasting, and that my father in the end would be spiritually alive and well and free, with eternity straight in front of him. I am very much looking forward to seeing him again. Chapter 12. Transitions. In February of 1992, my 12 years of using marijuana both frequently and infrequently came to an end. This had been coming for quite some time, since at this point in my life, I was only using once in a blue moon. After many years of using, the effect it had on me started becoming an annoying distraction that took away from experiences, as opposed to positively enhancing them. The electricity and excitement that it had once provided was replaced by a feeling of laziness and fatigue. After becoming sober, I began to realize that great music is great simply because it is, or that a hike in the woods is beautiful because it is beautiful. I discovered that all these activities and occasions are fantastic in and of themselves, and don't need anything artificial to make them better. It was extremely refreshing to be experiencing life, good and bad, all the time, on this completely real and honest level. As time passed, the need for my wife and I to branch out and leave my mother's home was becoming more and more obvious. We had saved enough money for a small down payment on a house and began looking at real estate in our area. This was a sobering experience. Neither my wife nor I made a whole lot of money at our jobs, and we soon discovered that homes in our immediate area were financially out of reach. Instead of looking at homes in other parts of the state where prices were more reasonable, we began throwing around the idea of building an in-law apartment onto my mother's house. This idea worked well for several reasons. The cost of an addition wouldn't suffocate my wife and I financially. Also, we could be there for my mother, especially as she was entering her elder years. And finally, it would allow us to stay in a part of the region that we both loved. We all agreed that this would work great for everyone involved, so we began laying the groundwork for what would become a rather large addition. The plan was my mother would move into the new building and my wife and I would take over the original dwelling. Everyone's future was beginning to take shape. Although this was an exciting and hopeful time in my life, the absence of pursuing my artistic aspirations was beginning to have an adverse effect on my being. For years I had felt a strong need to live and be true to myself as an artist, and was now feeling a bit empty without it. So when the dream of owning a home became a reality, I made a promise to myself to resume that journey, only this time I had a more clear picture of the artist I wanted to become, a jazz drummer. During my time away from playing and performing music, I had become a jazz music lover and rabid record collector, buying vintage albums at a record pace. My vinyl addiction took my wife and I all over New England and beyond in search of these rare and valuable treasures. I also purchased a set of 1960s Ludwig drums from an old jazz musician. These tubs were the real deal, and I spent an entire afternoon painstakingly removing old paint from the shelves, trying to restore them to their original finish. I stored them in the corner of the basement, knowing that it would only be a matter of a few months before I'd be taking them out, dusting them off, and working them hard to fulfill that musical promise. After my wife and I were approved for a 30-year mortgage, construction on our new addition began in the spring of 1994. Aside from some minor setbacks and some major squabbles between my mother, my wife, and myself, the building of this in-law apartment went smoothly. Little did any of us know that there was something very serious looming on the horizon. Chapter 13. The C Word. Beginning that summer, my mom developed a nasty cough and cold that none of us thought very much of. But as the weeks passed, her condition seemed to worsen to the point of having to see her doctor. To my wife, my mother's cough sounded eerily familiar. Her father had died of lung cancer some 10 years before. We all started to sense that something was seriously wrong, given the fact that my mother was a heavy smoker and had been for almost 50 years. Our instincts proved to be correct, for that October, after an X-ray and tissue biopsy, she was diagnosed with lung cancer. I think that life is a lot like the weather, where you have a few days of relative calm, followed by some disturbance that causes a change in the forecast. Sometimes the change is minor, and sometimes it's catastrophic. If life is like the weather, this would be a Category 5 hurricane. My mother's cancer was a crisis that would catapult me into a practice that would continue to this very day: daily prayer. Prayer, when it is good and positive, will have a good and positive effect on you. Trying to connect more firmly, more intimately with God was essential for me at this point in my life. Now more than ever, strength, courage, fortitude, and resilience were needed and received in abundance, not only for myself, but for all of us involved in this immense struggle. I would petition God with prayer every morning on my way to work and every afternoon on my way home. At night, I would meditate on God, trying ever so hard to open my mind, so to allow His indwelling presence to comfort and soothe, as well as strengthen and fortify my troubled soul, and as always, God never disappointed. These practices would not only serve me well during the time of my mother's disease, but they would be necessary for the many changes and challenges of the not-so-distant future. Everyone who was close to my mother tried to be positive and optimistic about the fight that was about to take place, but it was my mother who seemed weak and unenthusiastic about the battle with cancer she was about to go through. She had already been through a whole lot, so who could blame her? But regardless, the plan of attack would be to simply remove the lung that had the tumor within it. This would be followed by further treatment, chemotherapy and radiation, that would hopefully put her into remission and render her cancer-free. When the doctors went in to remove her lung, they saw that the cancer had spread like wildfire and that there was little they could do for her at this advanced stage. When she left the hospital, she moved in with my sister, who was better equipped logistically to take on the enormous task of caring for my dying mother. Once settled, she began to receive targeted radiation treatments in an effort to reduce the tumors that were sprouting up all over her body and perhaps prolong her life. There was nothing more painful than to watch my mother slowly wither away. We had made plans to bring my mother to her home for the final weeks of her life, but she wouldn't last that long. On January 21st, 1995, my mother died in her sleep. She was 64 years old. The last couple months of my mother's life were extremely painful both physically and emotionally for her as well as everyone who was closely connected to this struggle. It was heartbreaking to witness all the pain and suffering she had to endure, but those last months gave us the opportunity to talk about many things. It gave me the chance to express to her how sorry I was for all the grief I had caused her. I had been selfish and disrespectful, as well as arrogant and insensitive for many years. I also got to thank her for all that she did for my wife and me. My mother allowed us to live in her home all those years virtually rent-free. Eventually, she gave us her home, which was an enormous blessing. These final months of her life gave me time to, most importantly, say how much I loved and appreciated her. It was and still is so very reassuring to truly know that when my parents died, they were bound for heaven and eternity, and it is only a matter of time until we will all be reunited in another place with new and better vessels for our souls. This is the one very real silver lining in what is so oftentimes a very dark cloud. My hope is that they both knew that too. Chapter 14. White Picket Fence. With my mother's passing, ownership of this now very large and spacious home fell upon Catherine and I. We finally had the home we had dreamed of, but sadly it would be minus the doting grandmother who would have adored her grandchildren. The feeling was bittersweet. Life must go on, and it did. As a couple, we began making plans for starting a family of our own. Individually, we each had to pursue our life's goals. I began my quest to become a jazz drummer that spring. I took my drums out of storage and began a practice schedule playing no less than 30 minutes a day. Each day I would work on different skills. My plan was to practice by myself, or woodshed, for 1 full year before I would attempt to play with other musicians. I stuck to this plan like glue. That November, my wife and I conceived our first child. I recall feeling both fear and excitement in what we were about to embark on, but we were both ready as we could have ever been. Most important was the fact that we were still madly in love. We now had the home, steady employment, and some money in the bank, and we had had sufficient amount of time alone together. All our ducks were in a row. The time was right. The birth of our daughter Susanna on July 21st, 1996, was an epical event in our lives. Leaving the hospital, I remember looking around and thinking once again, everything looks different. And aside from the feeling of love I had for this helpless babe, there was a feeling of enormous responsibility. The life of this precious child was in our hands. I knew that I had to be a better person because parenthood would be the most important work I would ever perform. But what was most comforting to know that I wouldn't be alone in this endeavor. I had my wife in a solid marriage, good friends and family who lived locally, and now more than ever, the ultimate parent who resided within me, God. The first few weeks of parenting required a great deal of adjusting. Newborn babies are completely helpless and need almost constant monitoring. But my wife, who decided to be a stay-at-home mom, and I were strong and unified. Aside from some colic and sleep deprivation, we managed to settle into a comfortable groove. In addition to trying to be the best father I could be, I was also playing my instrument with a purpose and preparing for the next phase of my musical development, performing with other musicians. I was also working hard at my delivery job. In January, I managed to connect with some jazz students who were going to the Berklee School of Music in downtown Boston. Once a week, I would pack my drums into my car and make the drive downtown. This is where I got my first taste of ensemble playing. It took a while for the group to actually groove, but once it happened, it was pure heaven. This was a fantastic experience, but one that wouldn't last very long. The drive to Boston was tough enough, but the effort it took to find parking on the street, then unload a set of drums, get them into the building and onto an elevator, up several stories, then down a hall to a practice room, set them up, play for a couple of hours, then do it all over again in reverse was crazy. It became way too much effort, which forced me into looking for musicians that were closer to home. After trying out several players who didn't fit the musical idea I had in mind, I placed an ad, "Jazz Musicians Wanted," at a local music store. I soon received a phone call from two young horn players who were very serious about their music and eager to play. I had landed a bass player a few months earlier, so with the addition of the two horn players, I had my first full-fledged jazz quartet that rehearsed weekly in the living room of our large new addition. I got a great deal of satisfaction watching this group gel as a unit, as well as the strides I was making personally as a drummer. My long-time dream of becoming an artist was finally coming true. On the home front, everyone was doing great. My wife was living her dream of being a mother and homemaker, and our little girl, who was now almost 2, was plump, healthy, happy, and smart as a whip. Life was good, but unbeknownst to my wife and I, the most frightening day of our lives was just around the corner.